Welcome to another edition of the China Forum. My name is Kerry Dumbaugh. Today we'll be having a conversation with Ambassador Charles Freeman. He is a man of many talents. He's formerly was on the China desk at the State Department, where he very famously served as President Nixon's principal interpreter during his historic trip to China. Formerly an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, DCM for various missions around U.S. missions in Asia, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the list goes on and on. A conversation with Ambassador Freeman is always educational for the quality of his insights and entertaining for the thoughtful and elegant manner that he uses to express those insights. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Kerry. Pleasure to be here.
You have spent most of your career in working in China issues and in the Middle East. And given everything that's going on in early 2011 with protests in the Middle East, it seems that there's no one more perfectly positioned to address those topics and give us kind of the broad strategic picture about U.S. policy in Asia writ large. But it's a little hard to even know where to begin. I guess let's just start with your assessment of the Middle East, turmoil in the Middle East, and what this means for U.S. policy.
Well, the Middle East really in many ways was an exception to the process of decolonization that went on after World War II. Everywhere else, the sort of patron-client or protectorate role of the colonial powers clearly ended, and that wasn't the case in the Middle East. In Egypt, for example, which has just had a real revolution, a regime change forced by popular demonstrations, the British created the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army was dependent on them until 1952, when the Free Officer movement under Nasser threw out the British. They switched to protectorate relationship with the Soviets. And in 1978-79, Anwar Sadat, successor to Nasser, switched to an American protectorate. But you've had neo-colonial relationships. For example, Lebanon has been under strong French influence, and it's kept the constitution that the French imposed, which favored the Christians over other groups in the society. Tunisia, which also had a revolution, has been very much in the French orbit. So what's just happened is, to use a phrase from Chinese contemporary history, the Arabs have just stood up, and they have ended the quasi-colonial relationships they have had since World War II. And that's going to make life very difficult for the United States in the region, because essentially we've been able to rely on people who dependent on us for their retention of power to refrain from objecting to Israeli policies and behavior that enraged people on the street, and to protect us from the consequences of policies which were extremely unpopular in the region. And the ripple effects of this go well beyond the region, because you can see this in China with the crackdown on civil society, a communist party which is not confident about its own legitimacy, well aware that if there were a serious setback to the economy, its leadership role might well be questioned, and determined not to allow precedents to be established that would facilitate the kind of thing happening in China that has just happened in Egypt and Tunisia and is underway in Libya.
I want to get back to that, the consequences for China, in a minute, but do you see the Middle East unrest spreading, or that this is likely to happen, for instance, in Saudi Arabia or in some other countries? You know, there's been a lot of discussion about that. What are your projections? Can this be contained, or is it impossible to stop at this point?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, anybody who doubted that there was an Arab world of 340 million people now knows that there is. And within that Arab space, political contagion is very possible. And it is occurring. And we've seen some of it spread even to the Gulf, to Bahrain, which is an island state at the end of a causeway about 20 miles off the coast of Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia, since you asked about that country, is different. It's the only place on the planet which never experienced Western colonialism. No Western military ever penetrated it. No Western missionaries ever operated there. No Western merchants, even merchants, penetrated its interior. Saudi Arabia has an entirely authentic native political system which is regarded by its people as legitimate and which does not depend, and never has depended on foreign support for its survival. The only people who believe that foreign support is key are the ones associated with Al-Qaeda, who see the Saudi monarchy as dependent on us, but I don't think that's correct. So Saudi Arabia, when it experienced the West finally, did so in a very different way. Instead of Westerners arriving as conquerors or teachers or in a superior mode, we arrived as hired help in Saudi Arabia. And some people joke that the Saudis divide the world into two categories of people, themselves and potential employees. So it's a very, very different society. I wouldn't expect the contagion to get very far there, which is not to say that there aren't internal issues in Saudi Arabia. They are. They just happen to be a bit different.
Back to consequences for U.S. policy for a minute. There is always a lot of commentary when something like this happens that democracy is going to follow, that these are democratic resolutions, and that ultimately this is a good thing for the United States. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that the outcome necessarily is going to be democracy. Certainly there's nobody involved in these revolutions who sees the United States as a model. It's just not going to be taken that way. There's in fact a great deal of antipathy to the United States because of our policies in the region. And nobody wants to adopt our mores. Our moral standards are not highly regarded in the region. So the notion that somehow or other this is the dawn of American-style democracies is, I think, a bit far-fetched. The second point I would make here is that there's an unstated presupposition in that question or that theory, which is that democracies don't fight democracies. But that's, of course, complete hooey. Democracies do fight democracies all the time, and sometimes they're very cruel to each other. So the notion that the fact that a country has a democratic system and elections and so forth means that it will agree with the United States is widely disproved. I don't think the French, although they are democratic, agree with Americans about very much, or we with them. And I don't think Israelis and Lebanese agree about very much, although they're both democracies. And there is a democracy among Palestinians, but the last time I looked, that didn't bring them into congruity with Israeli positions.
To turn now to the China question. China has been expanding, going out, going west. They have this campaign, and their presence in the Middle East and elsewhere in the region, worldwide really, is just significantly expanded. Can you talk first about the position of the Chinese in this region of turmoil now, where they have interests, how they're trying to protect those interests?
Well, I think the involvement is overwhelmingly commercial, economic, not political. There's nobody in the region who sees China as a political model in any respect. China really doesn't have a great deal of political clout, although people recognize it as an increasingly important and powerful force on the world stage. They don't defer to China. China doesn't take positions that challenge people in the region very much. It tries to be the friend of everyone. It isn't militarily involved, although interestingly, the need to evacuate workers and citizens who've been resident in these countries, especially now in Libya, has led to the first long-range Chinese use of military aircraft, IL-76s, from the People's Liberation Army Air Force flying to evacuate Chinese citizens from Libya. And there's a guided missile frigate which just passed through the Suez Canal en route to Libya to protect evacuees as they're taken off by civilian vessels.
This is an old concept for us, but it's a very new concept to the Chinese.
This is unprecedented for the Chinese. They have done non-combatant evacuations, but not really using their military. And to do this in the Middle East, which is, in the case of Libya, it's not even in Asia, it's in North Africa, very far away, is something entirely new. But it's a natural consequence of growing commercial involvement. Construction companies engaged in doing infrastructure projects, housing, oil-related infrastructure, gas-related infrastructure projects all over North Africa and the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers taking part in this, 30,000 in Libya alone, it turns out. And in addition, there are Chinese investors and investments. For example, there's a Chinese car company that produces vehicles, taxis, and the like in Egypt. So the Chinese, in fact, are becoming very much involved in a way similar to that other economic great powers have been.
Has this involved, or is it involving a debate over doctrine about how to use the military? I mean, the Chinese have long held that they don't interfere in other countries' interests, in other countries' domestic affairs. That has to change a little bit when your own interests are so tied up. Is this being debated in the Chinese military?
I don't think there's a debate, for the simple reason that Hu Jintao, who is, after all, the head of the Central Military Commission, as well as General Secretary of the party and President of the country, Hu Jintao essentially has come out with a doctrine of which points the military toward operations other than war. These include disaster relief operations, and they include providing services to Chinese citizens in difficulty. So doctrinally, the Chinese are prepared for it. In terms of training, equipment, and prior experience, it's all very new.
Are they working with other countries? Is this something that the Chinese are interested in building up a reputation for, or a capacity for?
Well, I think they're interested in building up a capacity to take care of themselves. But since you raise the question of their working with other countries, there is, of course, a very interesting example of that in the anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden and the Gulf of Oman off Somalia, where the Chinese have now had several rotations of a 3-vessel presence, which has worked very closely and effectively with the NATO and other navies, including the Indians, who are taking an active role in trying to halt and address problems of piracy.
I want to go back to what you started to talk about initially, and that is the extent to which this kind of unrest elsewhere gives Chinese leaders sweaty palms. You know, the steps that are being taken in China to cut off internet access to these kinds of things. How worried are Chinese leaders about things like the possible contagion of protests like this?
I don't think they're very worried about the short term. I think they're more concerned about the precedents that permitting demonstrations might establish. And I think they're probably very suspicious that the calls for demonstrations appear to originate at a server overseas rather than in China, suggesting that somebody, perhaps dissidents who are overseas, perhaps even foreigners, may be behind the effort to generate some sort of turmoil in China. I think there's a very odd contradiction in the way the Chinese deal with these sorts of things. On the one hand, all the polling data and certainly anecdotal evidence, your own conversations with people, demonstrate a very, very high level of satisfaction on the part of the Chinese people with their system. They may have individual complaints, mostly about lower level officials and their misbehavior and corruption, but generally speaking, people like what has happened in China over the last 30 years and want to see more of it, not less. So there's every reason in the short term for Chinese to feel quite confident that they have the support of their citizens, the Chinese leaders have the support of their citizens. On the other hand, they are not in power as a result of any electoral process. Their legitimacy derives from a revolution that occurred 60-some years ago, and historical events which are now quite remote from the modern Chinese experience. When you speak to ordinary Chinese, they cite the fact that living standards are going up and opportunities for themselves and more particularly their children are expanding as the reason for their tolerance of, and I think it is just tolerance rather than active support of the Chinese Communist Party. I think every time something like this happens, it challenges the party to examine the question of its own legitimacy and to consider how it might legitimize itself in a more effective and reliable fashion. So you do see a bit of a discussion between those who pose or maybe are reformers, Wen Jiabao, for example, about political reform and its necessity and the opening of politics and a more participatory and transparent way of governance. So the implications are mixed, and it's complicated.